Your head isn't empty, quite the opposite, it's working at full capacity. Familiar formulas rush through your mind like soldiers being called to attention in the rain. But the weight pressing on your chest doesn't come from the difficulty of the equation. It comes from the gaze of the entire class behind you. Someone lets out a soft chuckle. A deliberately loud sniff. Even the creaking of chairs, ordinary sounds that now feel like daggers.
Professor Strauss remain standing tall, arms crossed.
Her face is unreadable, but her eyes burn. Not with anger. Not with challenge. But with the absolute power of someone who controls the heartbeat of the entire room.
Lucas swallow.
Part of him wants to sit down, to let it go, to leave the problem on the board as a clear sign that confidence has its limits. But another part, the part he usually hides, even from himself, stirs, like something stretching awake after years of sleep. He steps up to the board. Writes the first number.
À symbole. À variable transformation.
The room falls completely silent. She planned to set him up for failure in front of the entire class. But when he solved a problem that even graduate students struggled with, the whole lecture hall looked at her with completely different eyes. The grand lecture hall at the University of Michigan buzzed with the usual Tuesday morning sounds, murmurs of conversation, the rustle of notebook pages, fingers tapping on keyboards. It was another session of advanced calculus with Professor Strauss, a name known not only for the course's difficulty but also for her reputation of uncompromising rigor. Strauss was the kind of person who could silence a room just by walking in. Sharp features, silver-rimmed glasses, hair tightly pinned back, and eyes that didn't forgive mistakes. Even the most confident students instinctively pulled inward around her. Her reputation had been built on discipline and precision. If you wanted to pass her class, you had to earn it. There were no shortcuts. No sympathy. She strode briskly to the board, heels striking the tile floor with crisp finality. With a practiced snap, she broke a piece of chalk between her fingers. The room fell silent. Last session, we covered multivariable limits, she began, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Today, we move on to the Laplace transform. She turned to the board and began to write long equations in handwriting so steady it might have been typeset. Some students scribbled furiously, others already looked lost. Strauss was visibly pleased. Confusion, pressure, and unspoken competition were exactly the atmosphere she thrived in. She believed only the truly exceptional deserved to survive in mathematics. In the middle of the hall sat a student named Lucas Meyer, silently tapping his pen against his notebook. He wasn't confused. If anything, he looked slightly bored. Tall, lean, in a gray hoodie and worn sneakers, not the kind of student a professor noticed. Rarely spoke. Never sought attention. But inside his mind, numbers moved with elegance. Patterns, rules, and logic flowed like music, structured, rhythmic, orderly. He looked at the board. Something was off. Line 2. A small mistake, but enough to ruin the result. The coefficient had been moved out of the integral too early.
Lucas hésitated.
He could let it go. No one would notice. But if Strauss caught it later, she'd quietly fix it and pretend it never happened. Before he could decide, a girl in the front row raised her hand.
Professor Strauss.
I think there might be a mistake on line 2. Strauss turned, one eyebrow arched. A mistake, she repeated, as if the concept itself offended her. She glanced at the board, then gave a tight smile. There's no mistake, she said coolly. The girl's face flushed red as she looked down.
Lucas exhaled.
He hated this. Strauss never admitted she could be wrong. He raised his hand. Actually, there is a mistake, he said calmly. The class murmured. Heads turned. Strauss's expression didn't change, but her eyes flared slightly. Oh! She crossed her arms. Care to point it out, mister?
Meyer.
Lucas Meyer, he said, rising to his feet. He didn't like speaking while sitting. Line 2. The coefficient was pulled out too early, he pointed to the board. That disrupts the limits of integration. If you proceed like that, the final result won't match.
Silence.
Professor Strauss tightened her grip on the chalk and looked carefully at the board.
Juste un moment.
Then she saw it. He was right. Lucas expected her to nod, correct it, and move on. Instead, a tight-lipped smile crept onto her face. Well then, Mr. Meyer, she turned to face him fully, since you're so confident, why don't you come up here and do it correctly? A few snickers rippled through the hall. Lucas understood, this wasn't an invitation, it was a challenge. And she didn't yet know what she had just unleashed. Lucas stepped up to the board and took the chalk in hand.
The air in the lecture all thickened.
Every eye turned toward him, filled with curiosity, doubt, and anticipation. Professor Strauss stood behind him, arms crossed, her gaze as sharp as a scalpel, boring into his back. But Lucas didn't waver. He erased the mistake and began writing again. His handwriting wasn't as refined as hers, but each number, each symbol appeared clear and deliberate. As he wrote, he explained calmly. The issue was pulling the coefficient out too early. Doing that shifts the boundaries of the integral and distorts the entire function. The chalk scraped lightly against the board. The room was silent, save for that faint, steady sound. Within minutes, Lucas completed the solution. The final result was correct, not just accurate, but impressively neat and elegant. He set down the chalk and turned around. Professor Strauss stood motionless, jaw slightly clenched. Her eyes scanned the solution line by line, hunting for an error, a misstep, a missing justification, anything.
There was nothing.
Lucas had done it. And with finesse. She inhaled, then gave a small nod, her face unreadable.
Fine.
You corrected it. Congratulations. That was it. Some students exchanged glances. No one clapped, but the mood in the room had shifted. Lucas returned to his seat, eyes trailing after him. A few nods. A few skeptical looks. He didn't care. He hadn't done it to show off. He did it because he couldn't stand carelessness. Strauss turned back to the board and wiped away his solution. Let's continue, she said flatly. Then she paused. Meyer, she added, if you enjoy contributing so much, I assume you won't mind a challenge?
Lucas blinked.
What do you mean? She was already writing a new problem, long, tangled, complex.
Nested intégral, multivariable limit, differential transformation, a mass of mathematical rigor.
She turned to him again, eyes alight. If you're that sharp, she said, solve this. Lucas looked at the board. He recognized it instantly. This wasn't a typical assignment. It was graduate level, possibly unpublished in this course. She wanted to put him in his place. He stood. No complaint.
No hésitation.
He walked to the board and took the chalk again, this time for a real battle.
From the back, Someone whispered.
Wait, isn't that a grad school problem? She's trying to bury him. Professor Strauss stood with folded arms, her expression like steel, lips curled in a challenging smirk. Lucas didn't care. He began. The first line. The second. His hand moved with confidence, strokes firm and clean. In his mind, the process unfolded like a map, not trial and error, but orchestration. Every symbol meant something. Every variable beat with the rhythm of a language he knew by heart. The class was silent.
No more whisper.
Every student watched, transfixed. Midway through, Lucas paused and turned. Would you prefer I solve it in exponential form or trigonometric form? Strauss blinked, just briefly, but didn't flinch. Your choice, she said curtly. He nodded, then continued. The rest came faster, transformations, simplifications, and at last, the boxed result at the end of the board. He put down the chalk and turned.
Silence.
Then a soft whistle from the back. A few hushed exclamations. The lecture hall wasn't a classroom anymore, it was a stage, and Lucas had just closed a show no one saw coming. Professor Strauss approached. She studied the board. Her eyes scanned each line. 1, 2 minutes passed in silence. Lucas waited calmly. He knew she was looking for a crack, any oversight that could be magnified to erase his win. There was none. At last, she straightened. You skipped an intermediate step, she said. Lucas raised an eyebrow. I can write it out if you'd like. But it was a basic partial fraction simplification. I assumed it wasn't necessary. He didn't say it arrogantly. Just plainly. Strauss stood still, then shook her head. No need, she said, voice even but a touch quieter. She turned, walked to her desk, and placed her book down, a little harder than usual. Lucas returned to his seat. The stares that followed him now were no longer skeptical or amused. They were acknowledging. But Lucas knew this wasn't the end. And he was right. Lucas stood. No complaint.
No hésitation.
He walked back to the board and picked up the chalk, this time, not to correct, but to confront. A real challenge, no longer a lucky fix.
Below, whisper rippled across the lecture hall.
Wait, isn't that a grad-level problem? She's trying to break him. Professor Strauss stood with arms crossed, gaze like steel, the corners of her mouth curled in a sharp, challenging smile. Lucas didn't care. He began. First line. Second line. His hand moved smoothly, strokes confident and decisive. In his mind, the solution had already taken form, not as a puzzle to be solved piece by piece, but as a system.
Every symbole carriait meaning.
Every variable pulsed in rhythm, part of a language he understood as naturally as breath. The room was silent.
No more murmures.
Every eye was locked on the board. Midway through, Lucas paused and turned slightly. Would you prefer the exponential form or trigonometric representation? Strauss twitched, just slightly, but masked it well. Your choice, she replied, curt. He nodded and continued. The rest came quickly, transformations, simplifications, and finally, the boxed final answer crisp and clean. He set down the chalk and turned to face the room.
Silence.
Then from the back corner, a soft whistle. A few hushed gasps. The classroom was no longer just a lecture, it had become a stage, and Lucas had just brought the house down. Professor Strauss approached. She studied the board, eyes scanning every line. 1 minute. 2. Lucas remained still. He knew she was searching for even the smallest flaw, anything she could magnify to reclaim control. But there was nothing. Finally, she straightened. You skipped an intermediate step, she said. Lucas raised an eyebrow. I can write it out if you'd like. But it was a basic partial fraction simplification. I assumed it wasn't necessary. His tone wasn't arrogant.
Juste factual.
Strauss hesitated, then shook her head. No need, she said, voice level but a touch softer. She turned, returned to her desk, and placed her textbook down, a bit harder than usual. Lucas walked back to his seat. The eyes that followed him now carried no smirks, no doubt, only recognition. But Lucas knew this wasn't over. And he was right. The atmosphere in the classroom had shifted. Professor Strauss was no longer the undisputed center of the room. She still stood at the lectern, her voice steady and firm as ever, but the eyes of the students, at least a good portion of them, were now drawn, consciously or not, to Lucas. The student who had just made a graduate-level math problem looked like a crossword puzzle. Lucas knew he had disrupted the unspoken order. And that order would respond. So, Strauss said abruptly, turning on her heel. Her voice cut through the silence like an arrow. If you find everything so simple, I imagine you wouldn't turn down a real challenge.
Gasp flotteur de trous lecture hall. Whisper ignited.
The scent of challenge filled the air. Lucas looked up. What do you mean? Strauss smiled, not kindly, but like a chess master setting a trap. There's a regional mathematics symposium next month. It includes senior undergrads, graduate students, even a few young PhDs. High pressure, limited time, no board to redo things. I already had candidates in mind. But after today, you've made me reconsider. A ripple of murmurs passed through the room. Lucas squinted slightly. He understood, this wasn't praise. It was a gauntlet disguised as opportunity, a calculated move to teach him a lesson without having to say it aloud. Do you accept? She asked. If you're really as good as you seem. Lucas sat upright. His mind sorted through the choices. Decline, and let the whispers brand him as just lucky once. Accept, and become the center of a trial where every mistake would be magnified as failure. But in the end, he simply said,
Il do it.
A few soft gasps. A couple of shoulder pats from classmates. Professor Strauss nodded slowly, then turned back to the board. Then, prepare yourself. Lucas understood, this was no longer a class. It was a game. And the person in the robe wasn't necessarily the king. The news of Lucas joining the math symposium spread through the halls of the College of Natural Sciences in a single day. Students who had never paid him any attention began glancing his way as he walked into lectures. Some nodded with approval. Others eyed him skeptically, silently wondering, is that guy really that good? Lucas didn't care. He had work to do. He started studying harder than ever before. The library became a second home. Reference books, old symposium problems, challenges from Ivy League archives, all combed through.
Sleep night. Bitter coffee.
Endless rows of formulae scrawled over pages like veins. But it wasn't just Lucas who was preparing. One night, as he packed up near midnight, Lucas overheard two seniors chatting by the vending machines. She really picked that sophomore kid? Yeah, heard Strauss nominated him personally. Pfft. Don't know if it's a test or a polite way to send him off.
Lucas froze.
He knew they were right. This wasn't just a math contest. It was a trial to see if he could survive in a world that didn't expect, or want him to. And then something unexpected happened. Brian, a friendly student from his class, who had smiled supportively when Lucas first stepped up to the board, approached him at the library one Saturday afternoon. Heard you're competing next month? Brian said, placing a stack of papers on the desk. Lucas nodded. Yeah. Brian smiled faintly. I competed last year. Didn't win, but I've got experience. These are past problems I saved. If you have questions, just message me. Lucas looked at the papers, surprised. I thought you were part of Strauss's group?
Brian shrugged.
I'm part of math. If someone's good, they deserve support.
Note sabotage.
Lucas nodded, something warm blooming in his chest. He wasn't alone. 3 weeks remained. And Lucas was now carrying more than his own ambition. He carried the quiet faith of all those who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told they weren't qualified enough. And he knew this much: to change how people see you, sometimes all it takes is the right moment, and the right preparation. News of Lucas joining the mathematics symposium spread through the halls of the College of Natural Sciences in less than a day. Students who had never noticed him before began glancing his way every time he walked into class. Some nodded in quiet approval, others stared with skepticism, as if silently asking, is that guy really that good? Lucas didn't care. He had work to do. He dove into preparation like never before. The library became his second home. Reference books, past symposium exams, problem sets from Ivy League schools, he devoured them all. Sleepless nights, bitter coffee, and a flood of formulas that refused to stop. But Lucas wasn't the only one preparing. One night, as he packed his things near midnight, he overheard two senior students talking by the vending machine. She really nominated that sophomore kid? Yeah, I heard Strauss put his name forward herself. Can't tell if she's testing him, or sending him out to fail.
Lucas froze in place.
He knew they were right. This wasn't just about math. It was a test, to see if he could survive in a world where people like him weren't always welcome. And then something unexpected happened. Brian, a friendly classmate who had smiled at Lucas the first time he solved a problem on the board, approached him at the library on a quiet Saturday afternoon. Heard you're competing next month? Brian said, dropping a stack of papers onto the desk. Lucas nodded. Yeah. Brian smiled faintly. I competed last year. Didn't win, but I've got some experience. These are past problems I saved. If you need help, just reach out. Lucas looked up, surprised. Aren't you one of Strauss's guys?
Brian shrugged.
I'm a math guy. If someone's genuinely good, they deserve support.
Note sabotage.
Lucas looked down at the bundle of materials, then nodded, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. He wasn't alone. The symposium was 3 weeks away. And Lucas now carried more than just his own challenge. He carried the quiet hopes of those who had been overlooked, underestimated, and told they weren't qualified enough. And he knew one thing for sure. To change the way the world sees you, sometimes all it takes is the right moment, and the right kind of preparation. 3 weeks later, Lucas stood in the Grand Lecture Hall of Heidelberg University, the venue for the Central European Intercollegiate Mathematics Symposium. Tiered seats gradually filled with contestants from across the region: Munich, Prague, Vienna, Zurich.
On stage, à digital clock ticket down.
In front of it, a large whiteboard, individual desks, and sealed stacks of exam papers. In the audience, Professor Marianne Strauss sat upright, arms folded. Her face showed no emotion, but her eyes were sharp as a scalpel. She had offered no words of encouragement, no good luck. Only a curt nod when they crossed paths that morning. Lucas knew, she still wanted to see him fail. But he was no longer the quiet sophomore of weeks ago. He had trained. He had walked through doubt, and now he was ready.
Round 1, mental arithmétique.
Numbers flashed across the screen, additions, subtractions, square roots, repeating decimals. Many contestants furrowed their brows, hesitated. But not Lucas. His eyes moved over the numbers like a conductor reading sheet music.
Finger tapait the desk in rythme.
Without writing anything down, he submitted answers before the judges even looked up. Round 2, theorem proof. The section that made most contestants stumble. But Lucas was prepared. He picked up his pen, broke down the hypotheses, and built his argument step by step, like constructing a bridge across a canyon. A student beside him from ETH Zurich glanced over, not to cheat, but to confirm, he's actually doing it.
Round 3, the speed problem.
The screen lit up with the final challenge, a notoriously complex combinatorics problem, combining probability, calculus, and series transformation. Lucas took a deep breath. The hall fell silent.
The only sounds, pen scratching paper, and the blinking of the countdown clock. 1 minute, 5, 15.
Suddenly, Lucas looked up. A glint in his eye. He saw it, the structure behind the sequence, the hidden pattern only those who look deep enough can detect. His hand moved faster. Not rushed, precise. One final line, a subtle transformation, and the answer emerged. He capped his pen, folded his hands, and sat up straight. Next to him, a contestant was still scratching his head. Others were flipping through formulas. Then the bell rang. Judges collected the papers. Some contestants looked exhausted. A few wore anxious expressions. Lucas did not. He knew, he had just left a mark. From across the hall, Professor Strauss still didn't clap. But her eyes never left Lucas. And for the first time, they didn't carry certainty, but scrutiny. She wasn't sure anymore.
Lucas meilleur gaz.
He didn't need her praise. He didn't need her approval. He just needed the right moment, in the right place, to leave behind an undeniable truth. The room buzzed with whispers as the panel of judges stepped onto the stage, carrying a neatly stacked pile of graded exam papers. A silver-haired professor took the microphone, his voice calm but unmistakably clear. And the winner of the 2025 Central European Mathematics Symposium is
A brief pause.
Lucas Berger, from the University of Munich.
The atmosphere cracked open. Applause rippled.
A few cheers rang out. But mostly, there was stunned silence, faces that had been skeptical now frozen in disbelief. Lucas didn't leap up. He simply gave a slight nod and walked to the stage with quiet composure. The certificate was handed to him, along with a formal handshake from the judging committee. At the back of the hall, Marianne Strauss's gaze remained fixed, no longer proud, no longer cold.
Just silent.
As Lucas turned and stepped down from the stage, their eyes met. And then, she nodded.
Not for show, not out of obligation.
A real nod. The next morning, Lucas walked into the same lecture hall, sat in his usual middle row. The murmurs began almost immediately. Some students glanced his way with new eyes, curious, impressed, slightly cautious. Brian, one of his few friends in class, slid into the seat beside him, smirking.
The hero returns.
Lucas gave a soft chuckle and shook his head. Right on time, Professor Strauss entered. She set her briefcase on the desk and scanned the room. Her gaze lingered a moment longer when it reached Lucas. Before we begin today's lecture, she said, voice steady and clear, I want to announce that student Lucas Berger has won first place at this year's Central European Mathematics Symposium, surpassing dozens of candidates from top universities across the region.
Silence.
She paused, then continued. It's not easy to accomplish that. And it's even harder to do it without ever asking to be seen. A few scattered claps. Then more. And more. Lucas didn't rise, didn't wave. He just smiled slightly and nodded. Strauss turned back to the board, her tone level again. Now then, back to improper integrals. And just like that, everything moved on.
Nos grands célébrations. Nos longs speech.
Just a quiet student who had proven his worth, through something no one could deny, ability. Because some things don't need to be spoken for.
You juste stand your ground, do what is right.
And let the truth speak for itself. After class, Lucas left the lecture hall in silence. The spring sunlight stretched gently across the campus, and students clustered on the stone steps, still murmuring about the events of the day before. Some gave him quiet nods as he passed. Others looked away, avoiding eye contact. He didn't blame them. Silence doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from years of getting used to unfairness. Lucas walked through the faculty corridor. Then, the door to Professor Strauss's office creaked open.
Lucas, her voice called softly.
He stopped and turned. Could you come in for a minute? Her office was as tidy as she was. Sunlight filtered through the window, glinting off neatly stacked books. Lucas stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, waiting quietly. Marianne Strauss removed her glasses and placed them on the desk. A flicker of hesitation passed through her eyes. I was wrong, she began slowly. Not because I underestimated your ability, but because I've gotten too used to being right. Lucas remained silent. That day, when you stood in front of the class, I expected you to stumble, and I was ready to let it happen. But you made me listen. And listening is something people like me often forget to do. No, I'm sorry.
No, please forgive me.
Just the truth, and the admission of it. Lucas nodded. Not bitter. Not smug.
Juste à qui nod.
As if to say, I understand. And I'm strong enough not to need an apology. He turned, hands still in his pockets, and stepped back into the hallway where the afternoon light spilled long across the floor. A few weeks later, an email was sent to the entire mathematics department. This fall's mathematics competition will now be open to first-year students. Any student with exceptional in-class performance may be nominated, or nominate themselves. All talent deserves a chance to be seen. At the bottom was the familiar signature.
Prof. Marianne Strauss.
Lucas read the email and smiled. Sometimes, change doesn't arrive with a speech. T comes in an action. A shift.
À différents qu'un of look.
And sometimes, change begins with someone who never waited for permission. Because truth doesn't need an apology. It just needs to be recognized. After class, Lucas left the lecture hall in silence. The spring sunlight stretched gently across the campus, and students clustered on the stone steps, still murmuring about the events of the day before. Some gave him quiet nods as he passed. Others looked away, avoiding eye contact. He didn't blame them. Silence doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from years of getting used to unfairness. Lucas walked through the faculty corridor. Then, the door to Professor Strauss's office creaked open.
Lucas, her voice called softly.
He stopped and turned. Could you come in for a minute? Her office was as tidy as she was. Sunlight filtered through the window, glinting off neatly stacked books. Lucas stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, waiting quietly. Marianne Strauss removed her glasses and placed them on the desk. A flicker of hesitation passed through her eyes. I was wrong, she began slowly. Not because I underestimated your ability, but because I've gotten too used to being right. Lucas remained silent. That day, when you stood in front of the class, I expected you to stumble, and I was ready to let it happen. But you made me listen. And listening is something people like me often forget to do. No, I'm sorry.
No, please forgive me.
Just the truth, and the admission of it. Lucas nodded. Not bitter. Not smug.
Juste à qui nod.
As if to say, I understand. And I'm strong enough not to need an apology. He turned, hands still in his pockets, and stepped back into the hallway where the afternoon light spilled long across the floor. A few weeks later, an email was sent to the entire mathematics department. This fall's mathematics competition will now be open to first-year students. Any student with exceptional in-class performance may be nominated, or nominate themselves. All talent deserves a chance to be seen. At the bottom was the familiar signature.
Prof. Marianne Strauss.
Lucas read the email and smiled. Sometimes, change doesn't arrive with a speech. T comes in an action. A shift.
À différents qu'un of Luke.
And sometimes, change begins with someone who never waited for permission. Because truth doesn't need an apology. It just needs to be recognized.